Fellow human geographers, we are back at it again this evening. Tonight, we are going to examine political power and territoriality. We'll start with the formal definition of territoriality, which is the connection of people, their culture, and their economic systems to the land, or the behavior associated with the defense of or attempt to control the home territory. And territoriality is a learned behavior. It's not biological. So it can manifest itself in many different ways and at a variety of different scales. You may have a sign on your bedroom door declaring that it's your room. Schools have their home court with their school name or mascot painted on it. Communities of homes may build security gates that attempt to control who enters. Countries have citizenship requirements, national flags, and border security that attempt to control who enters and will defend those borders with military force if necessary. But why do any of this? Why do these different groups need to try and control these areas? It depends on the circumstances. Some people may want to control the natural resources, such as minerals or arable land. Others may want to protect cultural practices or preserve national boundaries. Still, other groups may want to establish policies regarding economic development or military presence. Territoriality is a central element of sovereignty, as territoriality is an attempt to control, and sovereignty refers to the authority to exercise that control. So let's draw a distinction. Say that you put a sign on your bedroom door declaring that it's your room. That's territoriality because you're attempting to control a space that you have a connection to. But whose room does it actually belong to? Probably your parents because they pay the rent or the mortgage. That is sovereignty because they have the right to control that room. So territoriality is an attempt to control an area, but sovereignty is the authority or the right to control an area. So the intersection between territoriality and sovereignty is an important one because groups may attempt to control an area, thereby demonstrating territoriality, but without being the final authority. For example, the Russian autonomous regions that you see here have some degree of sovereignty so that they can control their ethnic territory without leading to the fragmentation of the Russian state. So Russia has devolved power to these regions, granting self-determination and some sovereignty so that they can exercise territoriality without pushing for independence from Russia. And since territoriality is a learned behavior, there have been and will continue to be challenges to who has the final authority to control an area. For example, let's talk about the Spratly Islands. In recent years, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Vietnam, Taiwan, and China have all claimed sovereignty, control, authority over the Spratly Islands for largely economic reasons. It's believed there are significant, though unconfirmed, petroleum reserves beneath the islands, as well as fishing grounds that can supply work and food. Recently, China is attempting to expand its territorial holdings through dredging and land reclamation, building up small reefs into full-fledged islands, thereby creating new territory that it claims control over. Not to be outdone, Vietnam has now started expanding, building islands that it claims control over. So to recap, territoriality is a political and cultural strategy used by individuals, groups, and organizations to claim power over an area of land and its people and resources. So now, let's look at a few examples of how territoriality has been and will be important to political relationships. We'll begin with NeoColonialism, which is the entrenchment of the colonial order under a new guise such as trade and investment. So while the direct control of colonies was ending after World War II, indirect control of peripheral states was emerging. While many colonies gained independence and thus gained their political authority, their economies were still very much controlled by the whims of core states and multinational corporations. So periphery countries could theoretically make their own decisions on what to produce and how to produce it, but they often lack the tools, skills, and especially the funds to do it independently. So core countries, multinational corporations, and organizations like the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, would lease land or provide assistance in the form of high-interest loans that effectively tied the economies of former colonies to wealthier states, often countries that were their former colonizer. As core countries would be willing to pay premiums for raw materials and luxury crops, periphery countries often had little choice in what to produce. They often specialized in agricultural products such as coffee, cacao, bananas, and other crops grown on plantations, but as well as the extraction of minerals such as copper, iron ore, zinc, lead, and diamonds. And these were not grown for domestic consumption, but instead intended for export to core countries. In many cases, raw material exports are higher now than they were when the colonial period came to an end. And much of that wealth flows out of Africa and other regions that were colonized. So under the concept of neocolonialism, former colonizers were not willing to give up control of their former colonial territories. Instead, they maintained control now through economic domination, rather than the direct political or cultural domination these colonies experienced during the colonial period. Territoriality can lead to instability in regions known as shatter belts. Shatter belts are a region caught between powerful forces whose boundaries are continually redefined. These powerful forces amplify internal divisions and often lead to the breakup of shatter belt states, a process known as balkanization. Formally, balkanization is the process by which a state breaks down through conflicts among its ethnicities. So shatter belt states often have boundaries that are redrawn or adjusted, usually multiple times. Shatter belts often contain an important resource, such as mineral deposits, that attract world powers to that region. As a result, shatter belt states are often subject to frequent invasions and may struggle to develop economically. A few examples that you're going to want to know. Eastern Europe has historically been a shatter belt between Western Europe and Russia. More specifically, the former Yugoslavia and a region known as the Balkans is a good example of a shatter belt. It was culturally diverse, split between empires, and after the collapse of communism, very poor. And as we will continue to see throughout this unit, the Balkan Peninsula shatter belt highlights that nations fought for self-determination against outside powers as well as against members of their own state. Both East and Southeast Asia had shatter belts, particularly during the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. The Korean War and Vietnam War were proxy wars during the Cold War. The US backed South Korea and South Vietnam, while the Soviet Union supported communist forces in the northern part of both countries. As a result, both countries, Korea and Vietnam, were considered shatter belts due to the outside involvement between global superpowers. Other shatter belt examples include the regions surrounding the Caucasus Mountains, Sudan, and, at least according to some, the Middle East. Each of these examples have a high level of religious, linguistic, and ethnic diversity, combined with a high level of hostility among the groups living there, with varying levels of economic development. And especially in the Middle East and Sudan, the presence of oil has drawn the attention of outside forces that attempt to gain control of that precious resource. Our final discussion point tonight is about choke points. A choke point is a narrow strategic passageway that restricts passage to another region. They're usually straits or canals. These areas of limited space have a great deal of competition for their use and thus present an opportunity for countries to exert disproportionate control. These narrow territories can be sources of immense power, influence, and wealth. So let's look at a few examples. The Strait of Hormuz connects the Persian Gulf with the Arabian Sea. It's surrounded by Iran, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates, or UAE. It's the primary maritime, or water, route through which Persian Gulf exporters ship oil. Iran has threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz several times in recent history, which has prompted countries in the region, as well as the United States, to establish security arrangements or military presence to maintain that choke point remains open. The Strait of Malacca is a choke point for all goods shipped by sea between Europe, Africa, Southwest Asia, and South Asia to East Asia. At its narrowest point, it is only 1.5 miles wide, and it's more susceptible to blockades and piracy, which are prevalent in that area. The Suez Canal is the only sea route between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, and it is the shortest maritime trade route between Europe and the countries on the Indian and Pacific Oceans, greatly reducing the time and costs of transporting goods. Maritime choke points can create challenges for the flow of trade goods in the global economy and potentially put the global food supply at risk. And those challenges don't always need to come from the surrounding countries. In March of 2021, a massive cargo ship called the Ever Given became wedged in the Suez Canal for 6 days. It was estimated that this one blockage cost $400 million per hour in lost trade, totaling nearly $9.6 billion lost each day. And it makes sense when you see the number of ships that were held up due to this one blockage in a choke point. But hey, at least the memes were good. And that's how we'll leave it tonight. Have a good evening, and I'll see you back in class.